Hey everybody, this video is called The Awaited King, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at Joash, the crowning of Joash in Jehoiada. So, chapter 23, we're going to read verses 1 through 7. This is going to be a fairly quick video today. Chapter 23, verse 1 through 7. It says, "In the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself and made a covenant with the captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Jehoram, Ishmael the son of Jehohanan, Azariah the son of Obed, Maaseiah the son of Adadiah, and Elishaphat the son of Zitri. And they went out throughout Judah and gathered the Levites from all the cities of Judah and the chief authors of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. Then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. And he said to them, Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has said of the sons of David. This is what you shall do. 1/3 of you entering on the Sabbath of the priests and the Levites shall be keeping watch over the doors. 1/3 shall be at the king's house, and 1/3 at the gate of the foundation. All the people shall be in the courts of the house of the Lord. But let no one come into the house of the Lord except the priests and those who the Levites who serve. They may go in, for they are holy, but all the people shall keep at the watch of the Lord, and the Levites shall surround the kings on all sides, every man with his weapons in his hand, and whoever comes into the house, let him be put to death. You are to be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out." So 7 years later, Jehoshabeath's husband, the high priest Jehoiada, gathers sufficient support to have Joash crowned. And he's the Zadokite priest who resisted the queen and gained military support necessary for the temple and political reform. In the accounts in the Kings, it focuses more on the royal guard, whereas the chronicler here brings out the involvement of the nation as a whole and of the temple officials. In verse 2, it expands the king's account by depicting Joash widespread support in Judah. And this is one of the most dramatic moments in Messianic history. And the human offering of David has been reduced to just one person at this point in time, Joash. And if Joash had died, there would have been no human heir to the throne of David, and God's promise would be void. God would be a promise breaker. And it would mean for the destruction of the line of the Messiah. However, we see that God remediated here the situation by providentially protecting Joash, as we saw in our last video, chapter 22, verse 10 through 12, and with the elimination of Athaliah as well, we'll see coming up. And Jehoiada was a godly man who was concerned with the restoring of the throne of David to the line of David, taken away from this daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And Jehoiada was also the husband of Jehoshabeath and Shebaeth, and the woman who hid the young boy Joash and protected him from the Athaliah's massacre. And Jehoiada had a plan to dispose of this wicked queen Athaliah and replace her with the king boy. And these leaders, they needed to follow his plan carefully and to, most importantly, do it on the Sabbath. And Jehoiada chose the Sabbath for the day of the coup, because that was the day that the guards would change their shifts and they could assemble two groups of guards at the temple at the same time without bringing unnecessary attention upon themselves. In verse 8 through 11 it says, "So the Levites and all Judah did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and each man took his men who were on duty on the Sabbath with those who were going off duty on the Sabbath, for Jehoiada the priest had not dismissed the divisions. And Jehoiada the priest gave to the captains of hundreds the spears and large and small shields, which belonged to King David, that were in the temple of God. Then he set all the people, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the right side of the temple to the left side of the temple, along by the altar and by the temple all round the king. And they brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him testimony, and made him king. Then Jehoiada and his sons appointed him, and said, "Long live the king." So we see that Jehoiada gathered sufficient support to have Joash crowned. And Joash, the crowning, was a public and official ceremony recognition of making Joash as king. And in verse 11, the testimony we see in verse 11 speaks about the copy of the law that's also seen back in Deuteronomy 17:18 and Job 31 verses 35 through 36. And Lord willing, we're going to be ending the year kicking off Job. And Joash, he received a divine anointing and received praise when he was recognized as their king. In verse 12 and 13, it says, "Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord. When she looked, there was a king standing by his pillar at the entrance, and the leaders and the trumpeters were by the king. All the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Also the singers with musical instruments and those who led in praise. So Athaliah tore her clothes and said, 'Treason, treason.'" So Athaliah was oblivious to her position and had no thinking of there being any surviving son of Ahaziah. And now we see that Athaliah is learning that her grandson is alive, that he had escaped her murderous intent. And when she's comfortable believing that there were no legitimate claimants to the throne of David, she kind of was probably in a relaxed type state. And Athaliah's charge of treason technically is a case of treason. If you look at a definition of treason, you're going to see that this type of thing could constitute in a government as treason. And this was treason against her government, but it was well-founded, and this is where it was a godly treason against a tyrant ruler, wicked ruler. In verse 14-15, it says, "And Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were set over the army, and said to them, 'Take her outside under guard, and slay with the sword whoever follows her. For the priest has said, do not kill her in the house of the Lord.' So they seized her, and she went by the ways of the entrance of the horse gate into the king's house, and they killed her there." So we see right here that the queen is executed. And this was a just sentence against her because she was a woman of genocide. She wanted all the power and nobody to be able to challenge her. And Jehoiada, as a priest, had great concern for the sanctity and the reputation of the temple. And so we see that the queen here is executed in place where the horses entered. In verse 16-17, "Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and the people and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. And all the people went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They broke in pieces its altars and images, and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars." So verse 16, it acknowledges the Lord's sovereignty in all matters pertaining to the kingdoms and the lead to the eradication of Baal worship in Jerusalem. In verse 17, the house of Baal was likely a shrine to Baal that was erected for Athaliah in Jerusalem. And when you go back to the 2 Kings chapter 10, King Jehu supervised the destruction of the temple of Baal in Samaria. And they didn't just destroy the house of Baal and the building structure, they destroyed the sacred objects that were in there. And don't mind me, I'm taking out some mosquitoes around here. But we see his execution was carried out by the law of Moses against those who should lead others to false religion, as seen in Deuteronomy 13, verse 5 through 10. In verse 18 through 21, to wrap up the chapter here, says, and also Jehoiada appointed the oversight of the house of the Lord to the hand of the priests, the Levites, whom David had assigned in the house of the Lord, to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, as it was established by David. And then he set the gatekeepers at the gates of the house of the Lord, so that no one who was in any way unclean should enter. Then he took the captains of hundreds, the nobles, the governors of the people, and all the people of the land, and brought the king down from the house of the Lord. And they went through the upper gate to the king's house, and set the king on the throne of the kingdom. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had slain Athaliah with the sword. So Jehoiada took action to reverse the religious decline that had prevailed during the reign of Queen Athaliah. In verses 18 and 19, it emphasizes more than what was seen back in 2 Kings 11:18, that the new temple order under Jehoiada and Joash was according to the Mosaic and the Davidic design. And this provided an obvious lesson for the restored community regarding the worship at the second temple. And it was 6 dark years until now that the people rejoiced having a rightful king. And this was unheard of under the queen back under King Jehoshaphat, as seen back in chapter 20, verse 27. In the quiet city, it was a sign of God's blessing, as seen back across 1 Chronicles 4:40, 1 Chronicles 22, verse 9, 2 Chronicles 14:1, 2 Chronicles 14, verse 4 and 5, and 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 30. So for a quick wrap up with the video today, we see that the chronicler shows that Jehoiada, the high priest, was a hero. And his plan was to restore Joash to the throne of Judah. And we see that Joash is crowned king under him. We see the distress of the time that Queen Athaliah ruled when she discovered the plot that was against her. And we see that her and her supporters were executed. And we see the covenant that was made by Jehoiada as he restored the proper plans of worship and service. And this video, to make note, is recorded many days before the posting right now, because I am on vacation. So be praying for our family as we enjoy the rest of our vacation this week, and keep us in prayer for safety and travel. And like I said, keep us in prayer. It's a time that we are taken for rest and recuperation, and time to also remember Aiden, because Aiden would have been 13 on Monday this week. So just keep us in prayer, and we'll see you next time for our next video. We're going to look at the rise and the fall of King Joash. So Joash might be a better person than Athaliah, but he is far from being a perfect king. So we'll see you next time. God bless.